And joining us from the south of England is my old friend and colleague, Lieutenant General Sir Nick Borton. Good morning, Nick. How is it going?
Hello, Nicole. Very nice to see you and hear you. How are things in Switzerland?
Good. Very good. It's a frosty, cold morning, sunny. We had some snow, a little dusting of snow yesterday.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah. You going to come visit me this year?
Yes, yeah, we'll be out at the end of the year to see you, as usual.
All right. Are you going to come for Christmas and New Year again?
Yep, we'll come for Christmas.
Ah, perfect. Well, I imagine we'll be here unless something drastic changes. But got you on today. We've been talking about doing a podcast for I don't know, a couple of years now. But
yeah,
you were always in the army, and now you've recently retired. You were your last posting was as a commander of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. I got that right.
Well remembered.
At NATO, and so a senior NATO general, and now as a retired civilian, you are still an advisor to NATO. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I'm still working with the NATO chain of command as a senior advisor and one or two other defence-related advisory roles to keep myself out of trouble and off the street.
Yeah. So when you retired, I could imagine, did you ever just go in your garden with a bottle of wine and read a book for a day and do nothing?
I try to do that. I'm not very good at doing nothing. And even my sort of downtime I managed to fill quite satisfactorily, but I did make sure I had a good few weeks of rest, which everyone says you need to do after a hard 35-year career. So we went travelling and I spent a bit of time in my garden and annoyed my wife a bit to the point where she said it's time for you to go back out to work again. So no, I definitely had some good downtime, which they say is important and actually is easy to ignore after 35 years of working almost consistently hard at something. So definitely worth taking a break. But yeah, I'm definitely back into it now and sort of raring to go and busy as ever.
Yeah, so I must have met you in either late 97 or early 98. So I did a familiarization visit with the Royal Highland Fusiliers, which is now the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. And I came to do a fan visit and you picked me up. You were the first guy I met serving in the battalion at the time. And you picked me up from the airport in Belfast and dropped me off at the undisclosed location. And I sat inside an ops room for 2 days and I got flown back to England. That was a long time ago.
It was. Gosh, I had forgotten that. Yeah, that was our 97 tour. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've done, I'm sure you did tons of those things, but that was the first time we met. And then we served in the battalion together. And at one stage, we were with another podcast guest, Charlie Herbert, yourself, and me as company commanders in the battalion when we were in Cyprus. And you became Lieutenant General. Charlie became a Major General. Another Steve Cartwright was a Brigadier. And whatever happened to me, eh?
Well, I'm sure if you'd stayed in, you'd have been a general, Nicol. Everyone knows that.
Obviously, that was clear. You know, if I just stuck in there. But
yeah.
So we discussed. We've been on the phone a few times the last few weeks because I like to get, especially. I mean, I'm very excited about this. I love speaking to former colleagues, especially ones who are subject matter experts on certainly on geopolitics and strategic politics and what's going on in the world. And we discussed, because you've been in NATO, the fact that, there's a lot going on and it would be a good idea to get you on and to get your take on what's going on. And then a week ago today, it was confirmed that Donald Trump is now the president of the United States, and the situation has changed. And so we've had to change the theme of this podcast. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How did you expect Donald Trump to become president again?
Well, I think, like everybody, you're confronted unless you're working intimately in it. And actually, I think people probably working intimately within the US political system, none of them knew how it was going to work out either. The only thing everybody knew is it was going to be really, really close. And the other thing the polls told us in the days leading up to the election is that Kamala Harris was having a third, and having dropped back a bit, the polls all showed her creeping ahead. And if you'd asked anybody to put money on it, including the Republicans, it would have been absolutely neck and neck, and maybe Harris would have clinched it by a handful of votes, leading to probably a very unfortunate falling out and an argument by Donald Trump objecting to the results, etc. And that didn't happen. I'm never going to listen to another political poll in my life.
That's a good
Unless
point.
it's something really safe like the UK election, where anybody but everybody knew and agreed that the Labour Party were clearly going to romp home. The polls were clearly woefully off, and there's lots of reasons why that's happened. I think those are beginning to trickle out now, and if one's sort of interested and focused on domestic US politics, there's lots of interesting themes to get into there about why it was that a large number of Americans ignored the unpleasant things about Donald Trump's character that they could clearly see and maybe didn't agree with, but put those to one side compared to the things they cared about and which affected them politically. And he's got an enormously strong mandate, and he's, looks like he's taken the whole of Congress as well with him. So he's going to be in an extraordinarily powerful position in a way he probably wasn't the last time, and that Biden certainly wasn't this time. So we're definitely in for an exciting ride. I was talking to a Democrat last week who said, well, let's be clear, it's going to be a circus. Whatever happens, it's going to be a circus. So enjoy the show. But I think it will have an impact on a whole range of geopolitical and international relations in a way that the German election, the UK election, the Belgian election, clearly doesn't.
It's an interesting one because I recently joined Twitter X. I don't know, not that long, a fair few months ago maybe, and mainly because I'm trying to increase the reach of this podcast, to be honest, and trying to get on as many platforms as I can. But once you get onto that platform, you start seeing a huge disconnect between news on Twitter from independent journalists, independent observers, what have you, compared to what we see in the media. We call it the mainstream media, as people like to denigrate it by. I was pretty sure that he was going to win, and the internal polling there. You've got the betting guys on there. That there's guys who do the sports betting markets, but they were all over it, and they were. It was pretty obvious that he was going to win, from what I was reading. But at the same time, it is a toss-up. I understand that completely.
That's because you're listening to Musk-sponsored Republican messaging. So, of course, they're all going to say they were going to win.
No. I was following.
The facts of it are that nobody knew who was going to win until a lot of people who got up that morning and thought, I ought to vote Democrat, but no, I'm worried about the economy, I'm worried about wokeism, I'm worried about immigration, and so I'm going to pull those things aside and I'm going to vote for Trump. But you make a really important point, which is in the world we live in now, the media as such, and particularly social media, is not giving us a fair representation of the facts on the ground. It's giving people what they want and seek to hear. And the algorithms are all there, that if you go on social media, they see what you read, and the algorithms then reinforce your biases and preferences in the same way that when you go shopping on the internet, it keeps sending you coats or boots or whatever it was you're shopping for. And it's a really important impact on the way politics is playing out globally now, because in the past you could say there was an expression which is, you're entitled to your opinion, you can pick your opinion, but the facts are the facts. And the facts are no longer the facts, you can pick your own facts. And Trump is a great example of that. He just ignores the facts or railroads the facts he doesn't like and perpetrates his own facts that people believe. And that is having a significant effect on the rise of populism and, dare I say, autocracy across the political landscape globally, because young people are speaking with their voice, but whether they're gripping the ideology or the ideology is gripping them, the whole narrative is beginning to change. The average age of people who read newspapers, which on the basis of, certainly in UK, you could say the traditional newspapers, broadly speaking, give you a reasonable representation of the facts, albeit with a bit of political slant, not the huge political divide in this country. The average age of people who read paper newspapers is 64 years old. So the vast majority of the youth who are voting are getting their messaging on social media, and social media is feeding what they want to believe and reinforcing their own beliefs and biases, not necessarily, unless you're very careful, giving you an absolutely fair representation across the piece.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that. I 100% agree. And that's why I act on X. I actively follow people from both sides because I want to see what's going on both sides. I mean, I could make a point. I could make a point that whatever you want to think of Elon Musk is largely irrelevant. That he wanted a free speech platform, and perhaps those people who didn't feel like they were getting a free speech platform on the other social media networks gravitated towards there. And I could see that being a bias that way for sure. But, populism, I find that word, I don't know, it's slightly, disingenuous because, if you don't win an election unless you're popular.
That's true, but what we like to say, traditionally in this country, and I still think our election was a good demonstration of a very peaceful, straightforward election, not a single extra policeman deployed, change of power almost overnight, no great upheaval. Good that the US election has gone peacefully as well, because it didn't necessarily look like that was going to happen. But democracy, we can have a seriously philosophical debate about democracy. Remember what Churchill said, it's the worst form of government apart from all the others. But there's a difference between a democratically informed population who can take sensible decisions based on the policies of the parties presented to them and decide to vote for the people who are representing what they think is in the best interest of the country. Most people vote in what's the best interest of their particular bit of the population. But what we're seeing now, and populism is just the word that applies to it, but it's what we saw in the 30s, is the rise of disenchantment with the traditional political classes, with say, stale, boring, sticking to the routine, nobody changing upheaval, nobody changing the dynamic, and people instead having their inner biases and core concerns played to. And it happened to the British people during Brexit, where a number was done on us by those people who told us that immigration would finish, that we'd regain our sovereignty as if in some way the French were running UK. And the British people believed that, and now we are where we are economically with Brexit, which we're going to have to live with not for a few years, but forever. And so I think populism is the right term, because you're seeing themes across Europe. The German government has just collapsed. The days of compromise and coalition are failing, and the days of extremism, particularly focused on immigration, particularly focused on national sovereignty over alliances, which is what has kept us safe for the last 75 years. That's why I'm so passionate about NATO, because it's done such a good job for 75 years of preventing war in Europe. And these things are starting to crumble now, and look what's happening. So, there is definitely, a sort of, particularly in Europe, but generally a global shift towards sort of more extremist political narratives, which are gaining popular support, despite the fact, if you step back and look at them from a liberal point of view with a small l, which I still don't think is a bad thing, being a liberal. There's always interested me in the US election, being a liberal is, a horrendous thing, whereas for us, being liberal is sort of in the middle, sensible, middle of the road, that, where decent, compromising people want to be. But it's a term of abuse in Republican America. But, we are seeing the erosion of those sort of liberal ways of life, and people considering their own existence set against a broader policy of their country and the alliance and Western Europe and the rules-based order. Those things are starting to erode, and people are looking after their own little corner and stuff everybody else. And that's a dangerous place to get into.
I agree. It would be nice to go back to the time where, okay, let's just put it this way. As we know, history, you're a student of history as well, as we know that everything goes in cycles, and we have these rise, and it tends to be something around, for some weird reason, it tends to be around about an 80-year cycle, thereabouts. We had it in the 30s. It's resurfaced again now. And it's fundamentally these rises, this as you call it, a populist movement rises because of dire economic situation. And so people who are genuine, ultimately, they say all politics is local. Everyone's looking after for themselves and their families and their friends, right? We can agree on that. And if you are struggling to, house, clothe, and feed your family, then you start wanting to start listening to people who say they can bring it back. And I can understand that. Everyone would understand that. And perhaps this is just a part of the cycle. We've gone through a full cycle, and it seems to be that the way that civilization goes, and certainly in the West, is that we have this periods of chaos, war, and then come out on the other side saying that'll never happen again, but it always does.
Yes, I'm sure that's right, but I think there are some particular differences that make the current era more dangerous. One of those is social media, which we didn't have 80 years ago in the run-up to World War II, and social media enables autocratic personalities, and there are plenty one could mention from Trump eastwards to Europe who are beginning to pop up in democracies in Europe, who are able to use those digital tools in order to mobilize people in a way that was not so straightforward in the past. We've also got the world of cyber, where the line between war and peace is much less clear. Plenty of people will tell you we're already at war with China and Russia in the cyber domain because of the constant attacks that they deliver on us. So I think we're potentially in a more dangerous and unsettled world. And the other thing was that if you go back to the post-war period, so much of the stability that we enjoyed over the last 75 years that NATO played a part in was because there were sort of rules of the game, and there were two superpowers, Russia and America, and everybody fell under one umbrella or the other. The Warsaw Pact on one side and the Western democracies, and most of the global South as well, much of it as well supporting or sympathetic to America. But America and Russia's power was all powerful. They were the ones with the nuclear weapons. Stand past a little bit France and UK, but we were in NATO with the Americans. Are in NATO with the Americans, and so there was a sort of status that had a stable safety about it, and the rules of the game which we all understood when we grew up in the Cold War. That is not where we are now. We've got nuclear proliferation, which may well increase if people are nervous about how serious Trump is about maintaining an American position of global dominance as the world's policeman and using American power to ensure the rules-based international order. People are less confident in his desire to protect those broader alliances and the rest of us, then other people will start to seek nuclear weapons. I mean, can you imagine if the US left NATO, which I think is highly unlikely, but if they were to leave NATO, imagine what message that would send to the US's allies in the Indo-Pacific region, to Japan and Taiwan and Philippines and South Korea. And they'd all start, they'd be thinking what Iran's thinking now, which is, well, we definitely need to get nuclear weapons because we can't rely on the Americans to protect us. So I think we're in a much more unsettled world, and we've got many more emerging power bases like North Korea, like Iran, like China, in a way that wasn't the case during the majority of the Cold War, that's making it a multipolar world rather than a bipolar Cold War.
So is Trump the man to fix this? Do you think he can form an alliance and bridge the gaps between Russia and China and Iran and North Korea? He says he wants to.
Yeah, and ironically, he's got quite a good record in his previous 4 years of
exactly
stuff. I mean, you could argue whether pulling out of the JCPOA with Iran was genuinely a good idea, or whether it's actually led to some of the challenges we've got now, as it supported and detractors. But generally speaking, he does, his businessman approach to doing a deal, can on occasion seem successful. And it's certainly true that the US has appeared weak globally, and particularly in the Middle East under Biden, because they've put down markers on things and then not back them up. and dithered, essentially, and Trump is not a ditherer. I think it could go either way is the answer. Trump says he's the master showman, and of course it's all about what makes Trump look good. That's another unpleasant thing about modern politics, is a lot of it is about modern politicians seeking to make themselves look good and get voted in again, rather than necessarily what's in the best long-term interest. That's why in the old days we used to have statesmen and stateswomen. Now we have politicians. So I think it'd go either way with Trump. And as long as it's not a disaster, it'll be quite entertaining watching. But he could bring the Ukraine war to an end, so he says. Everyone's watching that, and already he's engaged with Putin, and Putin, has acknowledged him and said, let's have a discussion. We just need to make sure it's not a peace deal that completely stuffs the Ukrainians, or more importantly, in the longer term, it's actually a full deal that only lasts for the 4 years that Trump's in, and then the Russians rearm, and then they go again in 4 years' time. And the Ukrainians don't, probably quite rightly, trust the Russians one jot stick to any peace deal that's inflicted on them by Trump or anybody else. I think that the is a rather old-fashioned way of talking about it. The Indo-Pacific region is potentially an area of enormous instability and tension going forward, because Trump and his supporters seem so hawkishly anti-Chinese, and talking about 6% tariffs, which will drive China into a corner, which will mean they dump their cheap stuff on Europe, which will have an impact globally and will make US's allies in the Indo-Pacific region more nervous. So if he doesn't play that well, that could go badly.
Well, so we mentioned, let's go to Russia-Ukraine. What sort of, I know there's probably a lot of things you can't talk about, but I'm going to ask the question in it. What's the feelings in the corridors of power right now in NATO? What's Mark Rutte saying about this? An open and vocal critic of Donald Trump, by the way, in the past, which is so unfortunate, but he's now the boss. So what's going on?
Well, there's plenty of people who are vocal critics of Donald Trump who are busy now inviting him. I think that's just politics. Doesn't seem to unduly worry Trump. He's got people working for him like Vance who were rude about Trump in the past.
That's very
true.
I
mean, Ukraine is a fascinating and tragic problem. In many ways it surprised a lot of people, Ukraine. So it surprised the Ukrainian political class, the invasion, because they convinced themselves that it wasn't going to happen, which is a well-known historical political issue to ignore the imminent threat. So it was a surprise to the Ukrainian political class. It was a surprise to the Russian army, who had no idea that they were going to be ordered to invade Ukraine.
Is that right? I did not know that.
It wasn't a surprise to Putin, he ordered it, and the higher command, but the lower tactical levels were totally surprised, completely unprepared, thought they were going on exercise.
Were you aware of that? I guess you were.
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's a secret to say that, Western intelligence or UK and US intelligence had good indications about what was going to happen well in advance. It's all I'd say about that. So we weren't surprised. The Ukrainian army wasn't surprised because they've been locked in, horns with the Russian army in the Donbass since 2014. So this is the war the Ukrainian army was always expecting and preparing and getting ready for, and they always knew. And what was a surprise to the world is the fact that the Russians didn't win in 2 weeks, and that the Ukrainians held out, defeated the attack on Kyiv, and managed to stabilize the line, and then go on to the offensive at the beginning of last year very successfully, and pushed the Russians back in the Kharkiv area very significantly. But I think what is such a shame is that if we had, as a West, and say NATO, but NATO is not necessarily the organisation to do it because it's defensive, but if the Western alliance nations and the US and the rest and other countries in the world had properly got behind Ukraine then we could be looking at a very different story. But we did what we always did, which was penny pack it along, and spend months arguing about what we were going to give and tokenism, and we never really got behind them and backed them when it mattered. And the result is they're now on the back foot and losing, and we may have an enforced peace deal of some sort because America holds the levers, because Ukraine survives on American, ultimately on American power, unless the Europeans decide to step up personally themselves more significantly. So we had a chance, I think, well before the main Ukrainian offensive, which failed at the end of, in the autumn of last year, to really have made a difference here for Ukraine and to put the marker down against Russia and say this is not on. And we failed to take that opportunity in a meaningful way, and now we're going to have to live with the consequences. And the consequences will be a completely altered security architecture and posture across Western Europe for a generation to come with Russia. And we will have to pay for all of that. And we're going to have to pay even more now that Trump is in the White House. And we could have headed it off earlier if we'd been firmer in 2014, firmer over Crimea, and firmer in our response to the Ukrainian fighting to defend themselves.
So I kept a close eye on this. Seem to have excellent timing when it comes to interviewing generals on this podcast. Richard Sharef, it was the 23rd of February 2022. I did a podcast with him on Russia, Ukraine. Woke up the next morning and Russia had gone into Ukraine. And then we got this. We agreed to do this last week, and then that was on the Monday, and then on Wednesday, and here we are. And it's very fortuitous, and it's good to get these to be on the ball.
You're a Jonah. That's what it is, Nicol. You're a geopolitical Jonah.
So that's good. Yeah, I'm the curse of the West.
You are.
What I'm trying to say.
Don't interview anybody really important or with stuff.
Well, so I follow. I like to keep up on this sort of stuff, and I want to hear both sides of the story. And and I mentioned this to him, and I mentioned this to Charlie Herbert. And the point being was that there was a peace deal signed, and it was basically, I think, very, very, very basically, it was a line down the Dnieper River, and on the east side of that is the ethnic Russian Ukrainians, and on the west there are the ethnic Ukrainians, I guess you'd say. And it was to carve the country apart with the ethnic Russians on one side and the ethnic Ukrainians on the other side. And that was, I believe, the basis for the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements. And it still seems to me, as a guy who's absolutely nowhere near the levers of power, but just reading into the situation, that will be the end state if there is a peace deal. What do you reckon to that?
Well, it might be, but I don't think it's for us to pine on that. I'm going to discuss it, but I mean, ultimately, those are not the international borders that the international community, that either the traditional borders of Ukraine, going back, generations, nor indeed is it the international agreed borders of Ukraine when the Warsaw Pact broke up in the early 90s and Ukraine gained its independence. And, those are internationally recognized and approved borders. And so if we live in a world where we say it's okay for you to disagree with that and invade your neighbor because there are some Russian-speaking people there. So there are Russian-speaking people in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But we don't think it's okay for Putin to say, well, look, we'll just take the eastern third of Estonia because there's some Russian speakers there, despite the fact that it's Estonia's historical and internationally approved international border. That's not okay. Surely we live in a world and we represent an alliance where those things are things which are not to be breached. And, that's what we all, invest in defence for. And indeed is the prime role of any government in any democracy is to protect its borders and the people therein. So it may be that comes to be the case, whether it's as far over as the Dnipro River or whether it's the border of what they call the Donbass, so Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, which is effectively what they held from 2014 to 2021. There's the southern bit, I think, but I think the Ukrainians would absolutely be within their right to feel robbed if they were forced in any future peace deal, which may happen, to cede those bits of territory that have been seized in the last 2.5 years by Russia, because in 22 rather, because that is endorsing overt, unprovoked military aggression on an international neighbour that is not something that we've ever subscribed to as decent behaviour either now or in the recent past.
Yeah, I agree, but I'd mention unprovoked. You said before that this started in 2014, and the Ukrainian government in Kiev, but I don't even know how you pronounce it nowadays. It always used to be a chicken Kiev. Is it now a chicken Kiev?
It was Kiev when it was Russian, and now
right.
It's Kiev because it's Ukrainian.
Okay, good stuff. And so the government in Kiev decided, and they were bombing the eastern part of Ukraine since 2014. So I would argue it's not unprovoked. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, you have to explain that to me again. You think the Russians were fairly provoked into invading Ukraine in 2022?
No, I didn't say they were fairly provoked. You said there was an unprovoked invasion. And I'm just saying is that you've got a group of people who are ethnically Russian on the Russian border.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got their own government and their own government are bombing their own people, shelling their own people, causing thousands of casualties. And, would you not say that's an argument for provocation?
I'm not sure they were killing their own people. I'm not an expert on that. There were pro-Russian militias. There were military forces who were engaged in hybrid military activity within their own nation. And any nation has a responsibility. And we had 30,000 troops in West Belfast for 35 years in order to maintain the peace within our own national borders. I'm not suggesting that the Ukrainians ever always behaved absolutely immaculately, but, those were Moscow-sponsored, armed Russian militias who were deliberately raised and sponsored in order to upturn the political status quo in Ukraine. And I think it's completely unprovoked. They've invaded Ukraine and bombed its cities and destroyed its infrastructure and attacked its population in a completely unprovoked way. And if you look at Putin's narrative, it's all the West's fault because NATO's encroached, which they said they wouldn't, and that, we're backing him into a corner. But this is all about reinforcing his narrative for a new Russian Novorossiya and a new Russian empire, and re-establishing the greatness that he saw under the Soviet era. So, all of those things are all generated by the Russians as part of hybrid warfare. Did the Ukrainians always deal with it in the best way? Probably not. But yeah, I still maintain it was completely an illegal attack by the Russians into a neighbouring sovereign state, which in this day and age is not on. I don't think you could say that that's justification for 180,000 Russian soldiers invading your country and trying to capture your capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we discussed this in the pub a couple of years ago. Best place for it. On New Year's Eve, an even better night for it. And, we discussed this. Is there an end in sight? With your, let's call it your non-NATO hat, what's for you is the best case scenario, a best case outcome?
Well, the best case outcome would be that, the Russian war machine eventually grinds to a halt, and although he's got a preponderance on manpower that's currently affording him the tactical advantage, even the Russian pool of manpower eventually will run out, and the West, which is its current stated position, as John Healey, the Defence Secretary, said this week, we're in it for as long as it takes. If the West and the US and other global partners, because it's not just the West, continue to support Ukrainians sufficiently to enable them to get on the front foot, recapture the majority of the terrain captured by the Russians, since 2014, but particularly since 2022, and force the Russians, with their economy eventually presumably running out, no sign of that immediately, but eventually even the Russian economy, which adheres to normal rules of international economic behavior, grinds to a halt and suffers, and Putin eventually realizes his mistake and forces. That's the best case scenario. I think that's unlikely to happen, because I think, sadly, as I said, I think through Western appetite and certainly US appetite in light of the new administration to be in the long haul on the side of the Ukrainians for as long as it would take to bring the Russian economy and its army to its knees, is not there. I just don't think that will is there, and therefore we're going to grind into some sort of stalemate and peace deal in the next year or two, which will hopefully bring the war to end in the short term, but may well result in the Ukrainians having to accept that they're not going to recapture all of that terrain. And from a military point of view, speaking as a military man, right now the tactical prospect of them recapturing the Donbass and the Crimea for the Ukrainians is very hard to foresee in the immediate future. Now, with another couple of years of rebuilding up kit, and this year was always going to be Russia's year on the battlefield because the Ukrainians had kind of expended them last year. So this year, the Ukrainians are always going to have to be on the defense and bracing for the Russian blow. But, all battles and wars go in cycles. So next year would be the Ukrainians' chance to have another go. But still, it's an enormous tactical challenge for them to do that. You can see they're still struggling to hold on to their little pocket in Perth. A name redolent with history. So I think that's probably where we are. And, that's a shame. But the real issue is not how this ends. Of course it is for the Ukrainians, but in terms of global security, however this ends, it doesn't matter where you draw that line. The real issue is what's the security balance of power and stability going forward across Europe. What does that mean for Russian recapitalization, Russian rearmament? Will Russia say, right, that's great, we've done what we wanted to do, we'll call it a day? Or will they be emboldened by a weak Trump deal, which sees that effectively rewards the Russians for unprovoked military aggression and a bloody war of attrition, which effectively the Russians have won, and steals them and emboldens them for further land grabs across Europe? That's the big question, is how does it look globally across the Western security front going forward after any peace deal?
There's been some stuff in the press in the last few weeks about how there are now North Korean troops who are apparently at the front line. So that's what I read a few days ago, maybe 2 or 3 days ago. That there are apparently North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russian forces over there. How does that change the game?
Very good question. So I suppose there's a tactical implication and a strategic implication. I'm not sure the tactical implication is huge. I'm prepared to be proved wrong, but I doubt that 10,000 North Korean troops is going to make an immediate tactical change given the scale of the Russian army anyway. And of course, 10,000 troops is only a week's worth of casualties for the Russian army. So they lose currently they're losing about 1,500 casualties a day, the Russian army. So that's a week's worth of combat power that they've got from the North Koreans. I think it would be very interesting tactically, from a professional military point of view, to see how the North Koreans get on. They've clearly not fought in any wars since 1956. And so, how a whole bunch of green, probably really poorly trained and probably quite cold North Korean soldiers get on when confronted with Ukraine's most battle-hardened brigades, which are the ones they've got in Kursk, I think will be very interesting to see tactically how much they stand up to the shock of battle. The really interesting bit is what it means geopolitically. I mean, that is a huge issue. And you remember the Americans talk about the tilt to the Pacific. And in fact, we had a little tilt to the Pacific last year as well when we started sending aircraft carriers to Japan and deciding that was more important than our commitment to NATO and Western Europe. And it was like an either or. So the US is saying, right, you Europeans get on with dealing with Europe because we are much more worried about the Pacific, our allies there and our Western flank, etc. It's not an either or, I don't think. I think the fact there are North Korean troops now illustrates a much broader issue, which is this axis of well, axis of evil is the territory. What we got now is the axis of the sanctioned, axis of the unstable. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all acting together. And in fact, North Korea and Russia have just signed effectively a mutual defense, a la NATO, and that illustrates the point that we're dealing with a single problem now, single global problem from a Western security point of view. So the idea that you can abandon Europe and go and just deal with Indo-Pacific is nonsense, because you've got to deal with the totality of the problem, and you've got to deal with it as an alliance with all of your allies all together.
As you certainly know, but perhaps most people don't know, that North Korea, how would you even say this? Let's just put it this way, that they don't do anything without permission from China. Would that be okay to say that?
I think they do some things without permission with China, but China certainly has enormous sway. I think sometimes China's probably irritated by things North Korea does in a sort of junior partner way, a bit like Iran and its proxies. So I suspect they probably fail to check with the headmaster occasionally, or exceed their remit. What I don't know, and would be very interesting to know, somebody probably knows, is whether China had knowledge of, or even gave tacit approval to, the deployment of 10,000 North Korean soldiers to the Kursk salient. That would be fascinating to know. Somebody probably knows that, but I don't, off the top of my head, know that. But yeah, I think your general point is right, which is, North Korea is still to an extent a vassal state of China.
But how does that affect things then? So if it's now, because the way I see it, and this, again, just purely me, the battle lines are being drawn between NATO in the West, and now you've got China, North Korea, and Russia. And I believe Richard Nixon spent a lot of time, we brought China in from the cold, and to drive a wedge in between Russia and China.
Yep.
And that, to me, seems to be...
They even wrote an opera about it.
Pardon me?
They even wrote an opera about it.
Did they?
Yeah.
So I saw in Forrest Gump playing table tennis.
Yeah.
But
Nixon in China.
Yeah. So that and a very effective wedge between those two countries has now, seems to me, become they're aligning with each other. I'm not saying they're joining together, but they're certainly aligning with each other. And so you've got those three. I'm not entirely sure what the relationship between Iran and Russia is, but they seem to be aligned also. I don't know about India yet, but I think there's quite sensibly, I think, not picking any sides at the moment. But as a strategic man like yourself, what are the red flags for you? What does that say to you?
So I think therein lies the true challenge, strategically or geopolitically, that we're talking about, which is all of these adverse actors working together in a way that they hadn't necessarily always done in the past. So rather than being able to deal with separate little problems, you're dealing with a whole one. And if you take that model to its worst and most gloomy conclusion, that's what leads you to global conflict, which we're all trying so desperately hard to avoid. I do think, it wasn't also all that long ago that China and UK had excellent relations, and Chinese visited London during Cameron's premiership, and they were building power stations and all the rest of it. And what we've seen is a deterioration of that, as the Americans have seen growing Chinese global economic power, and therefore global reach, beginning to challenge what they see as American economic primacy. And of course, there's also the bad behaviours that go with it, which you can't deny, about industrial espionage, IPR being nicked, technology, hacking, cyber attacks, etc. That is all bad behaviour that drives a wedge. But I do think we ought to try really hard not to end up in a position with China that we've ended up in with Russia. It'd be very hard to, put it all behind us and come to the peace table with Russia and all be friends again after what's gone on over the last 2 years in Ukraine. It's not impossible, and one day we need to get to that point. And UK government policy was always to try and have a two-stage approach to Russia before 2022 when they invaded, obviously, which was to be firm about their transgressions, but also to keep the door open and try and maintain a dialogue, so that we didn't end up just, walking into a war. As Aldrich said about World War One, we had a war because it was almost too much trouble not to have a war. And we need to avoid that with the Chinese, and we need to keep that dialogue going and not end up in the position of complete loggerheads like we are with with Russia, accepting those challenges about Chinese behaviour, but try and keep it on the sort of economic and diplomatic front, and not stray into there's elements of the US military which make me nervous sometimes. If you go to US PACOM, dominated by the US Navy, whose entire existence is about preparing for a war with China, there's a sort of inevitability to the old Thucydides trap, about if you keep talking about war with China and preparing for war with China and saying war with China is imminent, then inevitably you'll have a war with China. And we've got to try and break that narrative and re-establish the diplomatic links and find the areas of ground that we have in common with them and work on that, lest we end up in a position that we don't want to be in.
My concern, I have a lot, but my main concern is numerical. As you know, I live in a very tranquil place in neutral Switzerland, in the middle of the mountains, away from all this.
Yeah, I'm going to come and join you, I think.
Yeah, well, anytime. My concern is the numbers. Is you've got, when you mention the global south, and I just want a definition on the global south, are you talking about below the equator, or are you talking everyone who's basically not in NATO or aligned to the West?
Deliberately loose media language, you're right to pick up on it. And, it's only the global south if you live in the north. But essentially, I suppose, in the context of our conversation, talking about those countries which aren't in Western Europe, not necessarily part of the NATO alliance, but in Western Europe, in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
It's been 1970s to talk about the north-south divide, isn't it? But
and the third world.
Yeah. The trouble with language, that's why we don't say the Far East, because it's only the Far East if you're British. If you actually live there, it's not the Far East at all. It's the Indo-Pacific region. And
yeah, you never think of that, do you? Yes. Yeah. So the point being is that numbers, numbers. If it all came to it, it seems that the numbers would be, if it's going to come, and I truly hope that this never does come to pass, and I pray that doesn't come to pass. But if it does get to a conflict, the West is outnumbered, no?
It depends, I suppose. So if you're just fighting Russia, then the Western countries and NATO have got more numbers than Russia and more money. Not necessarily more weapons yet, and that's why we need to get on and buy some more ammunition. The Chinese potentially have enormous people resources, but it's also about where you bring them to bear. So where are we going to fight China? Is that just going to be on Taiwan? Which bit of landmass are we going to be having a land battle on? They've got a huge army, but actually it's all about the sea. And the US Navy is extremely powerful. The Chinese Navy is getting bigger by the day and is exceeding, certainly in terms of shipbuilding and numbers, the US Navy. But again, quality has a quantity all of its own. But, that was said in 1940 when there was no technology. It was just warm flesh and cold metal and basic tanks. Now we live in an age where technology can have an enormously disproportionate impact on, a battlefield and on tactical outcomes. And the Chinese are still well behind technologically compared to the US, although they do a good job of nicking quite a lot of their technology. So, that balance is not clear by any stretch, and nor is it clear whether one's talking about a global war, in which case one's able to bring every single one of one's soldiers and tanks and ships to bear, or not. I mean, it always interests me when people say there's always a risk in the Middle East of a wider regional war. What does a wider regional war mean? Because Iran is right the other side of the Middle East from Israel, and neither army has an expeditionary capability. So it's not like the Israelis or the Iranians can jump into their landing ships and sail around into the Red Sea and attack each other, or into the Arabian Gulf and attack each other. All they can do is just swap missiles, which they're doing already, or have done already, to a limited point. So it's not a straightforward question to answer. Your point is right, but that's why staying at the front of the technological edge is so important, because you can offset that math. And right now, the Americans are ahead on that technological battle, and they need to make sure they stay ahead.
Yeah. I have a feeling that what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is just the beginning. I'm pretty sure that all the goodies are being held in reserve on both sides. And there's going to be, you obviously know about this and you obviously can't talk about it, but when you see in China, they've got a drone display doing a gigantic fire dragon dancing across the sky, or you see it in Dubai when they have these drone arrays doing all these we're, you and I are pretty much the same age. This is, for me, is bonkers to see. Like you're seeing a rocket coming back from space and getting caught on a platform, on, as I described, as a pair of toothpicks. That the technology is outpacing. Well, basically, my comprehension is how the hell do they do that? I'm not that old. We're not that old, Nick. And I had actually thought about this last night, is because I brought up the numbers question, because that's thing a lot of people ask, but it's the drone technology is at the same time super impressive but terrifying, and that coupled with AI is, we're not going to be seeing, it's not going to be armies meeting in the field like it was in the old days. It's going to be.
But you say that, but and you hit on a really important issue. Sorry, go on.
I was just gonna say, until all these things get blown up, and there's a nuclear pulse bomb that takes out all the electronics, and then it goes back to troops in the field.
World War I. Yeah, and so you've hit on the exact dilemma that every Western army, and probably most armies, and when I say armies, I mean defence forces, is wrestling with, and it's what the Ministry of Defence are right now wrestling with during the current defence review, which is, do you spend your money on mass and recruiting and training soldiers and buying tanks and artillery and all the other things that you need to go with them to fight a combined arms modern battle, or do you say that's way too expensive and dangerous and also risky, and we'll just spend the money on drones, AI, satellite technology, and long-range missiles? And I think what the Ukrainian war is showing us is you need both. And, both armies have got an enormous amount of drones. I mean, there's 1,000 drones up at any one time over the 700-kilometre front line in Ukraine at any 1 second in time from both sides. And yet, neither of those are a game changer. All that technology is not unlocking the battlefield. It's still in stasis. And you still need thousands of troops in order to hold ground. Let's be clear, what's holding the ground right now is the Ukrainian infantry. And what's seizing the ground is not Russian drones, it's Russian infantry. It's supported by all of those things, but you've got to have people to take control of the terrain that you're talking about. Now, I think we're on a very steep technological human gradient, I knew I'd get there eventually, in which one day in the future, the technology will be such that we won't need mass armies, and that you will be able to control terrain and have an effect on your opposition using, incredibly advanced, uncrewed systems, whether it's ships, tanks, spaceships, all the rest of it. We will definitely get to that point, but we are not at the point yet where the technology is sufficient to be game-changing on the battlefield without being supported by some traditional mass to hold ground, to clear. The Israelis haven't managed to clear Gaza with drones. They've had to do it by putting soldiers through the rubble and clearing it street by street and house by house. And the dynamic for that aspect of military life hasn't changed. One of the reasons we're seeing Ukrainian commanders under such enormous pressure at the front line is because they're having to deal with a newfound double pressure of the old-fashioned nature of war, visceral, bloody, people killing each other, the shock of battle, the clash of decisive wills on the battlefield that hasn't changed since Julius Caesar was a boy. But led on top of that, a level of technological complexity and managing the electronic warfare, the electronic magnetic spectrum, fighting their missiles to the target, managing thousands of drones and counter-drones and air defense missiles, and all of that technological overlay on top of the traditional battlefield. And those two things are creating enormous pressure on the Ukrainian commanders from bottom to top. So we're on a journey, and I think it will tilt more and more towards the technological, but we're not there yet.
It's interesting. We might see our first 21-year-old gamer general. Because these guys, I mean, if you ever tried to fly a drone, it's pretty hard.
I have, yeah. It's not very straightforward, but I know a lot of people who are better at it than I am.
I know it is very fascinating, and we've got front row seats to, we've grown up as kids and adults in probably the most fascinating period of history, I would suggest, or certainly the most technologically rapid advancement. One other thing I wanted to ask you about was the recent nuclear. The Russians changing their nuclear doctrine as potentially you could look at it as a more aggressive stance, a more hair-triggered stance. That's obviously a worry, because I listened to I think her name is Annie Jacobsen. She's Jacobsen, sorry. So the Swedish wife, Annie Jacobsen, who writes about nuclear technology, nuclear war. I don't know if you know her. She's very impressive. You know her, right? So she said, get this, that how long would an all-out nuclear war take? And the answer, the response was 72 minutes. And that is how long would it take to launch all the missiles and for them all to land? Because I didn't realize that these missiles are going up into space. Well, I had an inclination, but I didn't really quite grasp the technological aspect of it. But they launch them into space, and then they come down very, very fast. And they're very, very difficult to intercept. And that is the terrifying thing for me, for everyone, I think. And so what's your view on this? I just want to get like the strategic view on this, because it is a worry, it is terrifying, and we all have kids. We've all got families. Yeah. And everyone's going to be affected. There's going to be no winner.
And of course, that's why we have nuclear weapons, because they're the ultimate deterrent. That's truth in the title, the independent nuclear deterrent. And that deterrent has worked for 75 years. Somebody said, why do you have all these nuclear weapons that you never use? I said, we use them every day. Every day since those missiles were made in the 60s, we've been using them. And so, that balance has worked. And my sense is it probably is still working. So Putin has talked several times about rattling his nuclear saber, and has not even used tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Now, there might be lots of reasons for that. So I'm personally less worried about it. We came very close to it in the 1980s, but more than most people realise, around Able Archer. And we came very close to it in 62 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it was 62. Very close to it. So I'm less worried about that now. And, I think there's questions about the reliability of the Russian nuclear firing chain compared to ours, which, I'm extremely confident work. And I think our nuclear weapons are still doing what they were originally designed to do, which is provide the ultimate deterrent. Putin knows that in an all-out war with NATO, he'll lose. And he knows that if he escalates to nuclear, then Russia will be destroyed. And he's not so stupid as to step over that line. So actually, I think what you see is Putin, nervously sort of making those points, but never actually backing them up. And everyone said NATO deterrence failed over Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. Well, of course, Ukraine was not a member of NATO. And NATO deterrence is to protect NATO member states. So I would say NATO's deterrence has worked extremely well, because Putin has not attacked NATO, and NATO has never been stronger than it has now. Ironically, no one's done more for NATO alliance cohesion and unity than Vladimir Putin. So yeah, I'm less worried about that immediate problem than the prospect of a long, bloody conventional war in Europe, or the Chinese and the Americans swapping missiles over the Pacific. Taiwan, I think, is a really concerning area where the Americans are really going to have to work out, if they haven't done already, what their policy is to Taiwan, and then communicate that really, really clearly to China. And then we can all get on with having a debate about whose IPR is whose and whose cyber hacked whose companies and financial institutions without having to have a global war.
Well, you say that, and the succession of US presidents have endorsed or spoken positively, and that they support the one China policy. And the one China policy, for those listening who might not be aware of it, is that Taiwan is part of China. Whether Taiwan obviously don't particularly like that, but that's the one China policy. I'm right in saying that, yes? Just before I carry on.
Well, I'm no expert, but no, I think the Americans don't support a one China policy. So China claims that Taiwan is inherently part of China and should belong to it. The Americans disagree, and they support Taiwan's independence. What we don't know, the bit that's unclear in American stated policy, is whether the Americans will definitely fight. So if the Russians invade Poland, which is or Germany, which is a NATO member, we're all absolutely clear under Article 5 that we would all elect to fight one for all and all for one. What's not clear is whether the Americans might know this, but they've been a bit vague about it. We'll see if Trump's clearer. Will actually fight, defend Taiwan from a Chinese aggression. But I think that the Americans are actually clear that Taiwan should not be part of a one China policy.
Because I remember, it's my memory, but I'm pretty sure. No, I remember. Okay, maybe that's changed. But
let's quickly move on to something we know something more about then.
Okay, yeah, all right. But I'm just thinking, from a strategic point of view, is waging a war off the coast of China that's going to be a logistical
very
nightmare.
Difficult.
You've got the whole
very
Pacific.
Difficult.
Yeah.
Yes, where the Americans are based, they've got to get all the way across, the eastern end of the Pacific and the South China Sea, unhelpfully named by the British. We should have come up with a better name, because the Chinese go, well, it's called the South China Sea. Clearly we own it. They say, yeah, well, we called it that when we owned it that, and we owned China. So unhelpfully named. Imperial hangover. Plenty of tricky imperial
plenty of those
nomenclature and border issues, thanks to the British. I was reading about partitioning the other day, funny enough. But your point is right, which is that from a military point of view, the projection of military power into Taiwan and the Chinese coast is very difficult. And the Chinese hence are able to mess about in the South China Sea, backing into Japanese coast guards and particularly Philippine coast guards, who they're in a real sort of loggerheads with at the moment, almost at will.
Yeah, that's okay. I wasn't planning on going there, but one of my friends is half Filipina, and her fiance is a good friend of mine from Glasgow, by the way. And he has just recently been in the Philippines, and they are worried about this. So, hadn't planned on talking about it. What's your take on that one? Or why are they noising up the Filipinos?
Because there are a bunch of islands within what China calls the 9-dash line in the center of the South China Sea, most of which, or some of which, are very clearly within the territorial waters of the Philippines and some others in other countries. But because China, wrongly under international law, claims the whole of the South China Sea as its own. So under international law, most countries have a sort of 12 nautical mile boundary around their country, which is their national waters. So anything within those national waters belongs to them. And then they have I think it's a 70 or 75 mile economic exclusion zone, which doesn't stop other people going into it, but it means you have economic primacy. Those islands are flat in the middle of the South China Sea. So if you look at any map by any stretch of imagination, they're not Chinese. And nobody was actually on them, but they afford tactical advantage because they provide a sort of aircraft carrier, but also it's the principle of sovereignty. And the Philippines, and other countries are absolutely adamant that, they have the right to those, and they don't want to be bullied off them by the Chinese, but the Chinese are doing a really good job at bullying the life out of them. There's a small, hardy bunch of Filipino soldiers or Marines sort of marooned on some island with a ship who are sort of, clinging onto their flag to make the point. But it's indicative of this broader bullying behavior by China in the region that those smaller countries are also nervous about.
All right, well, let's pivot to a much more cheery note. Let's go to the Middle East. Let's go to Israel, Iran.
No. I was hoping we were going to run out of time before that.
Yeah, well, you know what? We can, if you want, we can stop it there, and we can do another one another time. But I don't know. Do you want? What's your thought on that? Is it something you want to cover?
I can cover it very quickly, and then probably you've had enough of me. All I'd say about the Middle East is it's a very difficult subject to talk about dispassionately as a strategic observer without people getting hot under the collar. And it's surprising, actually, to me, the extent of heat and light and emotion and passion it generates in UK, for example. We saw those awful scenes in Amsterdam last week over the football match about something that most people don't understand the detail of. They just see it as a binary human rights issue. But Israel has a right to defend itself, and on the 7th of October, that awful attack occurred, and we don't know the half of it, by the way. I've, spoken to some people. I mean, the atrocities perpetrated by the Hamas fighters when they came over were unspeakable. And our hearts sank, because the people who were going to suffer at the end of that were the people of Gaza. The Palestinian people were always going to be the people who bore the brunt of that. And Hamas knew that, and they cold-bloodedly engineered that attack, and then retreated back into Gaza to their arms bases under children's schools and hospitals, knowing full well that their people would act as a human shield. So it's a very difficult and emotional situation. And Israel has clearly not always handled it anything like as well as they should from a humanitarian point of view. From a military point of view, dispassionately, they've done a surprisingly good job about writing down Hamas. As a military observer, you'd say that military operation went way better than anybody would have given them credit for. It's just unfortunate that they have not managed the humanitarian disaster attendant to it better. But the people who played their hand really badly, I think, are Iran, who had established their proxies around Israel, and all of those proxies are failing them, and Iran have essentially been caught out. And now the Israelis have very cleverly taken down Iran's air defense system in that very calibrated attack, whether it's because that's what the Americans told them to do or that's what they elected to do, to wait and see. And they were probably sensible to wait and see because they got Trump, which from an Israeli point of view is probably better. So it's definitely not over. Will it ever be over? I think the sadness is that attack by Hamas has done more to set back the cause of the Palestinian people and peace in the Middle East than anything in a very long time. No Israeli in the current state is going to back a two-state solution, if indeed a two-state solution is indeed the right answer. The historian Neil Ferguson said last year, and I think he's absolutely right, is not everybody gets to have a country. Scots did not get to have an independent country. The Catalans, the Basques, don't have an independent country. Lots of people in history don't get an independent country, and maybe that is the fate of the Palestinian people. Does that mean that they should live in misery and starvation and the appalling conditions they're in? Absolutely not. And we've got to somehow move the dial away from the war to a point where, the international community could do more to have a conversation about how that future looks. I think there's plenty of sensible Israelis who realise that the current situation is unsustainable. The Israelis don't want to be at war forever, but they are besieged and frightened and angry, and they quite understandably have a right, a need, and a desire to protect themselves. Hezbollah, the day after the 7th of October, started firing missiles again into northern Israel and displaced 60,000 people and killed dozens of Israelis. So, no country on earth would put up with that without going into southern Lebanon and doing the same thing. We'd have done exactly the same thing. It's just not always very attractive to watch, and an utter misery, particularly for the poor old Palestinians.
Yeah, that's for me. I'm very pro-human. I'm pro-humanity, and I don't want to see this. No one wants to see this. I mean, obviously, you don't want to see this either. I find it's a bit depressing, but we live in hope. Nick, I have to say, this is a fantastic chat. It's good to get, you're up there and what's going on. There's a lot you can't tell us, but it's good to get, some balance, because there is so much going on that we don't know about. And, the worst case scenario is going to be that it all kicks off, because then everyone loses. Everyone's going to lose, and how many leaders actually survive going to war? They get voted out straight after, as in the case of Winston Churchill. There's just no winning. And I hope that there's people like you, when there are people like you, advising to make sure, hopefully, that we can get this done sensibly and quickly, ideally.
I think that's a very good summary of where we are, Nicol. That's definitely the most serious conversation you and I have ever had, and it's easy to get depressed. But I'm an optimist, really, and I believe in human spirit and human kindness, and you say, trying to keep talking and try and look beyond ourselves and our own backyards, and hopefully calmer heads will prevail, and we'll get through this somewhat tricky period in international relations and onto a more stable one. But let's not be downhearted, as they say.
Yeah, I agree. So just a huge thank you for coming on. It's been wanting to do this for a long time, and I'm very, very, I'm honoured actually, Nick, that you take the time to come and shoot the shit with me,
Not at all. The honour was all mine.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Nick. Nick Borton. Amazing. Great chat. And thanks for listening, everyone.
See you in the
Take care. Bye. Bye.